Colorado Territory, 1874. The rolling foothills of the Rocky Mountains stood silent witness to the small wagon train making its way across the valley floor. 8 canvas-covered wagons created a dusty procession against the endless blue sky, the settlers within them seeking a new beginning in the promised lands of the West. Among them was Rose Vallier, 20 years old and as uncertain of her future as the wildflowers that trembled in the spring breeze. Rose sat perched on the wagon bench, her slender fingers gripping the rough wood as the wheels bounced over the uneven terrain. Her chestnut hair was pulled back into a practical bun, though rebellious tendrils had escaped to frame her face in the day's heat. The simple blue cotton dress she wore had once been her Sunday best back in Pennsylvania, but after months on the trail, it had faded into an everyday garment. "We'll be making camp soon," said the man beside her, his voice carrying none of the warmth one might expect from a future husband. Jeremiah Blackwell was 45, a successful rancher who had advertised back east for a bride. Rose had answered his advertisement out of desperation when her parents died of influenza, leaving her alone with no prospects and mounting debts. She nodded, keeping her eyes fixed on the horizon. Marriage to a stranger seemed a small price to pay for security in this vast, untamed land. At least, that's what she told herself with each passing mile that brought her closer to a life she hadn't chosen but had accepted as her fate. The frontier was no place for romantic notions. That's what everyone had told her. A woman needed protection out here, and protection meant compromise. Love was a luxury few could afford when survival demanded so much. As the wagon train rounded a bend in the trail, a small party of riders appeared in the distance. Rose tensed instinctively, her hand going to her throat. Stories of bandits and raids had filled her dreams with nightmares throughout their journey. "Cattlemen," Jeremiah said, narrowing his eyes. "Probably from the Hayes Ranch. They control most of the grazing land in this valley." Rose watched as the riders approached. There were 5 of them, dust-covered and sun-bronzed from life in the saddle. But it was the one who rode slightly ahead that caught and held her attention. Even at a distance, there was something in his bearing that spoke of quiet authority. The riders slowed as they neared the wagon train, and the man in front raised his hand in greeting. "Ho there, welcome to Silverdale Valley." Jeremiah nodded curtly. "Blackwell, Jeremiah Blackwell. I've purchased the old Miller property." The rider's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "That's so. Miller's place borders Hayes land to the north and east." He touched the brim of his hat, and for the first time his gaze fell upon Rose. For a moment time seemed to pause as their eyes met. He was younger than she'd initially thought, perhaps 25, with clear blue eyes that stood out against his tanned skin. Unlike many of the rough men she'd encountered on their journey, his face was clean-shaven, with only the suggestion of stubble along his strong jawline. A shock of wheat-blonde hair fell across his forehead beneath his hat. "Hunter Hayes," he said, his voice softening as he addressed her directly. "My family's ranch is just over that rise." Rose felt a warmth creep into her cheeks under his steady gaze. "Rose Vallier," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Miss Vallier will be Mrs. Blackwell before the week is out," Jeremiah declared, placing a possessive hand on Rose's arm. "As soon as we get settled at my property." Hunter's expression remained unchanged, but something flickered in his eyes. "Well then, congratulations to you both." He touched his hat again. "If you need anything, the Hayes Ranch is always willing to help newcomers. These mountains can be unforgiving to those who don't know their ways." With that he nodded to his companions, and they continued past the wagon train, kicking up dust in their wake. Rose found herself watching him go, wondering at the strange hollow feeling his departure left in her chest. "Hayes," Jeremiah muttered, spitting over the side of the wagon. "Old man Hayes has been trying to push everyone out of this valley for years, wants it all for his cattle." Rose said nothing, but as the day wore on toward evening, she found her thoughts returning to the young rancher's clear blue eyes and the way they had seemed to see right through her practiced composure. That night, as the wagons circled and campfires dotted the darkness, Rose sat alone, watching the flames dance before her. Tomorrow they would reach Jeremiah's ranch and her new life would begin, a life of duty and practicality. A life without the foolish dreams that had once filled her younger days. The frontier was indeed no place for romance. It was a place of survival, of hard work and harder compromises. And yet, as she gazed into the fire, Rose couldn't help but wonder if there might be more waiting for her in this wild country than merely surviving. The following day, as their wagon pulled up to the weathered two-story house that was to be her new home, Rose felt a flutter of apprehension. The Miller property, as it was still called, had clearly been neglected. The barn leaned precariously, and the house itself needed paint and repairs. Fields that should have been planted lay fallow, and the fences sagged in disrepair. "Needs a woman's touch," Jeremiah said gruffly, as if reading her thoughts. "That's why I sent for you. A man needs a wife to make a house worth coming home to." Rose nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. This was her duty now. To turn this neglected house into a home, to cook and clean, and eventually bear children for a man she barely knew. She had made her choice, and now she would live with it. The following days passed in a blur of endless work. Rose scrubbed floors, washed windows, beat rugs, and tried to bring order to the chaos. Jeremiah spent his days working the land or in town, arranging for supplies and hiring men to help with the heavy work of restoring the ranch. 3 days after their arrival, the local preacher came to the house. Rose was given an hour to prepare herself for the wedding ceremony that would bind her to Jeremiah Blackwell until death parted them. She wore her best dress, a pale yellow cotton with lace at the collar and cuffs. Her hair she arranged simply, with a few wildflowers tucked into the knot at the nape of her neck. The ceremony was brief, with only Jeremiah's newly hired hands as witnesses. Rose spoke her vows in a clear voice, determined to honor the commitment she had made. When it was done, the preacher shook Jeremiah's hand and patted Rose's shoulder awkwardly before departing, leaving the new bride alone with her husband. That night, Rose learned what was expected of her in all aspects of marriage. Jeremiah was not cruel, but neither was he gentle. He took what was now rightfully his with the same businesslike efficiency with which he approached everything else. When it was over, he rolled to his side of the bed and was soon snoring, leaving Rose to stare at the ceiling and wonder if this emptiness was all she would ever know. The weeks passed, and summer settled over the valley with a vengeance. Rose fell into a routine of cooking, cleaning, mending, and tending the small kitchen garden she had planted. Jeremiah treated her with the distracted consideration one might show a valuable piece of livestock. He was not unkind, but neither did he see her as anything more than a necessary addition to his property. It was on a sweltering August afternoon that Hunter Hayes rode up to their homestead. Rose was hanging laundry on the line, her sleeves rolled up and her hair damp with perspiration when the sound of hoofbeats drew her attention. Hunter dismounted in one fluid motion, removing his hat as he approached. "Mrs. Blackwell," he said, the formality of the name somehow ill-fitting in his mouth. "Is your husband at home?" Rose tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, suddenly aware of her disheveled appearance. "He rode into town for supplies. He should be back by sundown." Hunter nodded, his blue eyes taking in the improvements to the property. The barn stood straighter, the fences had been repaired, and the house sported a fresh coat of white paint. "The place is looking better," he observed. "Thank you," Rose replied, unsure if the compliment was for her or Jeremiah's efforts. An awkward silence fell between them, broken only by the sound of laundry flapping in the breeze. "There's fresh lemonade," Rose offered suddenly, "if you'd care for some while you wait." A smile broke across Hunter's face, transforming his features. "That would be mighty welcome, Mrs. Blackwell." "Rose," she said, the word escaping before she could consider its propriety. "Please call me Rose." His smile deepened. "Rose, then." She led him to the shade of the porch, where a swing had recently been installed. "Please sit. I'll fetch the lemonade." In the cool darkness of the kitchen, Rose took a moment to collect herself, pressing her hands to her flushed cheeks. There was something about Hunter Hayes that unsettled her, made her forget the careful boundaries she had built around herself. When she returned with a tray bearing 2 glasses and a plate of cookies, Hunter was examining a small whittled figure of a horse that sat on the porch railing. "Did Blackwell make this?" he asked, holding up the carving. Rose shook her head. "I did back home in Pennsylvania. My father taught me. It passes the time in the evenings." Hunter's eyebrows rose in appreciation. "You've got talent. The musculature is perfectly captured." "Thank you," Rose said, setting the tray on a small table. "My father raised horses. I grew up around them." "But not out here?" Hunter asked, taking a seat on the swing. Rose handed him a glass of lemonade. "No, I'd never been west of the Mississippi before the wagon train." Hunter took a sip of his drink, watching her over the rim of the glass. "What brought you all this way?" The question was innocently asked, but Rose hesitated. How could she explain the desperate circumstances that had led her to answer Jeremiah's advertisement? The shame of facing destitution, of having no other options. "My parents died," she said simply. "There was nothing left for me in Pennsylvania." Hunter nodded, seeming to understand what she left unspoken. "The West offers fresh starts," he agreed, "though they often come at a price." The way he looked at her then made Rose wonder if he could see the price she had paid written on her face. She turned away, focusing on the distant mountains instead. "What did you need to see Jeremiah about?" she asked, changing the subject. "Water rights," Hunter replied, his tone shifting to something more businesslike. "The creek that runs through your property feeds into Hayes land. There's been some confusion about access." "I see," Rose said, though in truth, she knew little of such matters. They fell into conversation about the valley, with Hunter pointing out landmarks visible from the porch and telling her the history of the area. He spoke of his family's ranch, started by his grandfather 30 years earlier, and of the small town of Silverdale, nestled at the far end of the valley. "You should come to the Harvest Festival next month," he said. "The whole valley turns out. There's dancing and food, contests for the children." "That sounds lovely," Rose replied, trying to imagine Jeremiah at such a gathering. He rarely spoke of social events, preferring to keep to himself. The afternoon wore on, and Rose found herself more relaxed in Hunter's company than she had been since arriving in Colorado. He listened when she spoke, seemed genuinely interested in her thoughts and opinions. It was a novel experience for a woman who had grown accustomed to being seen, but not heard. When the sound of an approaching wagon heralded Jeremiah's return, Rose felt an unexpected disappointment. Hunter must have sensed it, for he gave her a gentle smile as he rose to his feet. "Thank you for the lemonade, Rose, and the conversation." "You're welcome," she replied, gathering the empty glasses. As Jeremiah's wagon pulled into the yard, Hunter turned to her once more. "Remember what I said about the Harvest Festival. It would be good for you to meet some of the other women in the valley." Rose nodded, though she doubted Jeremiah would agree to such an outing. The idea of an evening of music and dancing seemed as distant as the stars that would soon fill the night sky. Jeremiah was not pleased to find Hunter Hayes waiting for him. The two men spoke briefly about the water rights issue, their conversation terse and formal. Rose watched from the doorway, noting the tension in her husband's shoulders and the careful neutrality of Hunter's expression. When Hunter finally departed, Jeremiah turned to Rose with a scowl. "Hayes men are trouble, always have been. I don't want you getting friendly with any of them." "He was just being neighborly," Rose defended, immediately regretting her words when Jeremiah's scowl deepened. "Neighborly, the Hayes family has been pushing smaller ranchers out of this valley for years. They want my land, Rose, and they'll use whatever means necessary to get it." Rose said nothing more, but as she prepared dinner that evening, she wondered about the truth of Jeremiah's claims. Hunter Hayes had not seemed like a man with ulterior motives. But then again, what did she know of men and their ways? She had been sheltered in her upbringing, naive in the ways of the world. That night, as Jeremiah claimed his marital rights with the same detached efficiency as always, Rose closed her eyes and tried to feel something, anything, other than the emptiness that had become her constant companion. And when sleep finally claimed her, it was not her husband's face that haunted her dreams, but a pair of clear blue eyes that seemed to see the woman she truly was beneath the dutiful wife she pretended to be. September brought cooler temperatures and the promise of autumn to Silverdale Valley. The aspens on the mountainsides began to turn golden, creating a patchwork of color against the evergreens. Rose found herself watching the changing landscape with a sense of wonder, having never witnessed the dramatic seasonal shifts of the high country. Despite Jeremiah's reservations, he eventually agreed to attend the harvest festival. "It's important to show our faces," he conceded grudgingly. "Let people see we're here to stay." The day of the festival dawned clear and crisp. Rose wore her best dress, a deep green wool with a fitted bodice and full skirt. She had spent hours the previous day washing and styling her hair, which now fell in soft waves down her back, held away from her face by two simple combs. Jeremiah barely glanced at her as they climbed into the wagon for the journey into town. "Don't get too comfortable," he warned. "We won't be staying late, there's work to be done tomorrow." Rose nodded, clutching her shawl around her shoulders, as the wagon bounced along the rutted road toward Silverdale. Despite Jeremiah's dampening attitude, she couldn't help but feel a flutter of excitement. It would be her first real social event since arriving in Colorado, her first chance to meet other women and perhaps form friendships in this new place she now called home. Silverdale was a small but growing town, with a main street lined by wooden buildings housing the essential businesses: a general store, a bank, a saloon, a small hotel, and a church. For the festival, the street had been closed to traffic, with tables and benches set up in the center. A wooden platform at one end served as a stage for the musicians, who were already playing lively tunes as people gathered. As they pulled up to the edge of town, Rose could see that nearly everyone in the valley had turned out for the celebration. Families with children, elderly couples, young men and women dressed in their finest all mingled together in a colorful, noisy crowd. Jeremiah helped Rose down from the wagon with perfunctory courtesy, then immediately headed toward a group of men gathered near the saloon. "I need to speak with Johnson about those cattle I'm buying," he said over his shoulder. "You go on and find the women." Left to her own devices, Rose stood uncertainly at the edge of the gathering. She recognized no one, and the prospect of introducing herself to strangers suddenly seemed daunting. She was contemplating retreating to the wagon when a warm voice called her name. "Rose, you came." She turned to see Hunter Hayes approaching, and despite herself, her heart lifted at the sight of him. He was dressed for the occasion in a clean blue shirt and dark trousers, his blonde hair neatly combed beneath his hat. "Mr. Hayes," she greeted him formally, aware of curious eyes turning their way. "Hunter, please," he corrected with a smile. "Come, let me introduce you to some people. My sister's been eager to meet you." Before Rose could protest, Hunter had gently taken her elbow and was guiding her toward a group of women standing near a table laden with food. Among them was a young woman with the same wheat blonde hair and blue eyes as Hunter, though her features were softer, more delicate. "Charlotte," Hunter called. "This is Rose Blackwell, the new bride I told you about." Charlotte Hayes turned with a warm smile. "Mrs. Blackwell, we've been hoping you'd come. It's not often we get new faces in the valley, especially one so welcome as yours." Rose found herself enveloped in a friendly embrace before being introduced to the other women. Mrs. Peterson, the preacher's wife, Hannah Williams, who ran the general store with her husband, and several farmers' and ranchers' wives whose names blurred together in Rose's nervous mind. "We were just discussing the quilt for the raffle," Charlotte explained, drawing Rose into their circle. "Every year we make one to raise money for the school." "Do you sew, Mrs. Blackwell?" asked Mrs. Peterson kindly. "Yes," Rose answered, finding her voice at last. "And please call me Rose." The women welcomed her easily into their conversation, asking about her journey west, her impressions of the valley, and offering advice about surviving the coming winter. Rose felt the tension that had gripped her for months begin to ease as she laughed and talked with these women who had once been strangers to the valley themselves. As the afternoon wore on, the festival grew more lively. Children ran races and bobbed for apples, men competed in horseshoe pitching and arm wrestling, and the women proudly displayed their preserves, baked goods, and handwork for judging. Rose found herself being drawn into the festivities, tasting Mrs. Williams' famous apple pie, clapping for the children's races, and even being persuaded to enter one of her whittled figures in the crafts competition. "You never said you were an artist," Hunter remarked, appearing at her side as she placed her carving of a mountain bluebird on the display table. "Hardly an artist," Rose demurred. "Just a hobby." "A remarkable one," Hunter insisted, examining the delicate wooden bird. "You've captured the spirit of it, not just the form." Rose felt a blush creep into her cheeks at his praise. "Thank you, it helps pass the evenings." Something in her tone must have betrayed her loneliness, for Hunter's expression softened. "It can be isolating out here, especially for newcomers." "Yes," Rose agreed, unable to deny the truth of his observation. "But days like this help." Hunter smiled, and Rose was struck again by how his entire face transformed with the expression. "That's what community is for," he said. "None of us could survive out here alone." "Not really." The fiddlers struck up a livelier tune, and couples began to gather in the cleared space before the platform for dancing. "Would you care to dance?" Hunter asked suddenly, extending his hand. Rose hesitated, glancing around for Jeremiah. She spotted him still deep in conversation with several men near the saloon, a glass of whiskey in his hand. "I'm not sure my husband would approve," she said reluctantly. Hunter's gaze followed hers. "It's just a dance, Rose, at a public gathering with the whole valley watching. There's no harm in it." Perhaps it was the music, or the rare feeling of belonging she'd experienced that day, but Rose found herself nodding. "One dance," she agreed, placing her hand in his. Hunter led her to the edge of the dancing area, then turned to face her, one hand taking hers, the other coming to rest lightly at her waist. The touch, though entirely proper, sent a shock through Rose unlike anything she had ever experienced. As they moved together to the music, Rose found herself relaxing into the steps of the dance. Hunter was a skilled partner, guiding her through the turns and patterns with subtle pressure and gentle encouragement. "You dance beautifully," he commented as they circled the floor. "My father insisted I learn," Rose replied, surprised at how natural it felt to be in Hunter's arms. "He said every young lady should know how to dance, even if she lived in the middle of nowhere, Pennsylvania." Hunter laughed, the sound warm and genuine. "He sounds like a wise man." "He was," Rose said softly, a pang of grief momentarily dulling the joy of the dance. "I miss him every day." Hunter's hand tightened briefly on hers, a gesture of understanding and sympathy that required no words. In that moment, Rose felt a connection to him that transcended their brief acquaintance, as if he truly saw her grief and honored it. The dance ended all too soon, and as the music paused, Hunter reluctantly released her. "Thank you for the dance," he said, his voice low. Before Rose could respond, a large hand clamped onto her arm. "Time to go," Jeremiah said, his voice tight with anger. "Now." Rose looked up at her husband in surprise. His face was flushed, his eyes hard as they glared at Hunter over her head. "We've only just arrived," she protested, immediately regretting her words as Jeremiah's fingers dug painfully into her arm. "I said we're leaving," he repeated, his tone brooking no argument. Hunter stepped forward, his expression concerned. "Blackwell, surely you can stay a while longer. The judging hasn't even happened yet, and Rose has entered a carving that's sure to win a prize." Jeremiah's face darkened further. "Keep your nose out of my business, Hayes, and stay away from my wife." Without waiting for a response, he pulled Rose away from the dancing area, marching her through the startled crowd toward their wagon. Rose stumbled along beside him, mortification burning her cheeks as she felt the eyes of the entire town upon them. Once they reached the wagon, Jeremiah practically lifted her onto the seat before climbing up beside her and snapping the reins. The horses lurched forward and Rose gripped the edge of the seat to keep from falling. They rode in tense silence until they were well away from town. Then Jeremiah turned to her, his face livid. "What were you thinking, dancing with Hunter Hayes? Making a spectacle of yourself." "It was just a dance," Rose defended, her voice small against his anger. Everyone was dancing. "Not with the son of the man trying to ruin me," Jeremiah shouted. "Do you have any idea how that looked? My own wife flirting with the enemy right under my nose." "I wasn't flirting," Rose protested, shocked at the accusation. "It was a harmless dance at a public gathering." Jeremiah's laugh was harsh and without humor. "There's nothing harmless about a haze. That whole family is poison. The old man wants my land and now the son wants my wife. Well, they won't get either." "Hunter doesn't want me," Rose said, her cheeks burning at the very suggestion. "He was just being friendly." "Friendly?" Jeremiah scoffed. "I saw the way he looked at you, and worse, I saw the way you looked at him." Rose fell silent, unable to deny what she herself didn't fully understand. There was something about Hunter Hayes that called to her, that made her feel seen and valued in a way she hadn't experienced before. When they reached home, Jeremiah stopped the wagon and turned to her, his anger seemingly cooled to something colder and more calculating. "You're my wife, Rose. I paid good money to bring you out here, set you up in my home. I expect loyalty in return." The reminder of their arrangement, of her essentially being purchased like cattle, struck Rose like a physical blow. But it was the truth. She had agreed to this marriage knowing full well what it entailed. "I am loyal," she said quietly. "I was only trying to be sociable, to make friends in the valley." Jeremiah studied her for a long moment before nodding. "Just stay away from the Hayes family. All of them, that's all I ask." Rose nodded, though the prospect of never speaking to Hunter or Charlotte again sent a pang of loneliness through her that was almost physical in its intensity. That night, as she lay beside Jeremiah's sleeping form, Rose wondered if this was to be her life, always carefully navigating her husband's jealousies and suspicions, forever denied the simple joy of friendship and community. The thought brought tears to her eyes, and she turned her face into the pillow to muffle her quiet sobs. The following weeks brought the first hints of winter to Silverdale Valley. Frost appeared on the ground each morning, the aspens lost their golden leaves, and the air carried the promise of snow. Rose threw herself into preparing for the cold months ahead, preserving the last of the garden's produce, mending clothes, and ensuring the house was as weathertight as possible. Jeremiah seemed to have forgotten the incident at the festival, or at least had chosen not to mention it again. He was busy with his own winter preparations, bringing in the hay crop and seeing to the cattle he had recently purchased. One crisp October morning, as Rose was hanging the last of the laundry, she spotted a rider approaching from the direction of town. As the figure drew closer, she recognized Charlotte Hayes, her blonde hair visible beneath a practical riding hat. Rose glanced toward the barn where Jeremiah was working, then quickly moved to intercept Charlotte before she came fully into view of the house. "Charlotte," she called softly, hurrying to meet the other woman. "What are you doing here?" Charlotte dismounted, her expression a mixture of determination and concern. "I came to see you, of course. You disappeared from the festival so suddenly, and no one's seen you since." "The ladies were worried." Rose felt a rush of warmth at the thought that these women, still virtually strangers, had been concerned for her. "I'm fine," she assured Charlotte, "just busy with winter preparations." Charlotte's clear blue eyes, so like her brother's, studied Rose's face with uncomfortable perception. "Hunter told me what happened. About your husband's reaction to the dance." Rose looked away, embarrassed. "Jeremiah is protective." "There's protective and then there's unreasonable," Charlotte stated bluntly. "It was one dance at a public gathering, for heaven's sake." Before Rose could respond, she heard the crunch of boots on gravel. Turning, she saw Jeremiah approaching, his face set in grim lines. "Mrs. Hayes," he said coldly. "What brings you to my property?" Charlotte straightened, meeting his hostile gaze directly. "Good morning, Mr. Blackwell. I came to invite Rose to join our quilting circle. We meet every Wednesday at the church." Jeremiah's eyes narrowed. "My wife is too busy for such frivolities. Winter's coming and there's work to be done." "Even the busiest woman needs fellowship," Charlotte argued, her tone remaining pleasant but firm. "And quilting is hardly frivolous. The quilts we make keep families warm through the winter, and raise money for the school. Rose held her breath as Jeremiah seemed to consider this. Finally, he shrugged. "Do as you please," he said to Rose. "But I expect my dinner on the table when I come in from work, quilting circle or no." With that he turned and strode back toward the barn, leaving Rose and Charlotte standing in surprised silence. "Well," Charlotte said finally, a smile breaking across her face. "That's settled then. Wednesday at 10 o'clock at the church. I can come by and ride with you if you'd like." Rose nodded, a small spark of joy kindling in her chest. "I'd like that very much." As Charlotte mounted her horse to leave, she turned back to Rose with a serious expression. "Hunter asks about you, you know. He's concerned." Rose felt her cheeks warm. "Please tell him I'm well. And thank him for his concern." Charlotte nodded, a knowing look in her eyes. "I'll tell him. See you Wednesday, Rose." As she watched Charlotte ride away, Rose felt a confusing mixture of emotions. Guilt at the pleasure she took in hearing that Hunter thought of her. Hope at the prospect of regular social interaction with the women of Silverdale, and beneath it all, a growing dissatisfaction with the emptiness of her marriage. The quilting circle became Rose's lifeline through the early winter months. Every Wednesday, Charlotte would arrive on horseback, and the two would ride together into Silverdale for a few precious hours of female companionship. The women sewed and gossiped, shared recipes and remedies, and offered one another the support that only those who understood the challenges of frontier life could provide. Rose never saw Hunter on these outings, though Charlotte occasionally mentioned him. She learned that he ran much of the Hayes Ranch operations now that his father was getting older, that he had a gift for working with horses, and that despite being the most eligible bachelor in the valley, he showed little interest in courting any of the available young women. "Pa despairs of him ever settling down," Charlotte confided one snowy December afternoon as they rode back toward the Blackwell ranch. "Says he's too particular by half." Rose kept her eyes on the trail ahead, unwilling to examine too closely the flutter of interest she felt at this information. "Surely there must be someone he admires," she said carefully. Charlotte shot her a sidelong glance. "There might be, but Hunter's always been one to want what he can't have." The implication hung in the cold air between them, unacknowledged yet impossible to ignore. As they approached the ranch, Rose could see smoke rising from the chimney, indicating Jeremiah had returned from whatever business had taken him away that morning. She felt the familiar tightening in her chest that accompanied his presence lately, a mixture of duty and dread that had become her constant companion. "Thank you for the ride," she said to Charlotte as they reached the yard. "I'll see you next Wednesday." Charlotte reached over to squeeze her hand. "Stay warm, Rose, and remember you always have friends in this valley." The simple declaration nearly brought tears to Rose's eyes. Friends. After months of isolation, the word held a warmth that rivaled the fire waiting for her inside. That night, as she served Jeremiah the stew she had prepared before leaving that morning, he surprised her with an announcement. "I'll be going to Denver after Christmas," he said, breaking off a piece of cornbread. "Got business with the bank in the land office, might be gone a few weeks." Rose nodded, keeping her expression neutral. "When do you leave?" "Day after Christmas. I figure to be back before February, weather permitting." He glanced up at her. "You'll be all right here alone. The hands will keep the stock fed, and there's plenty of firewood split." "I'll be fine," Rose assured him, already thinking of the solitude that awaited her. It should have frightened her, the prospect of being alone in the isolated ranch house during the harshest part of winter. Instead, she felt a guilty sense of relief. "Good," Jeremiah said, returning to his meal. "I've worked too hard to let this place go now. The Hayes outfit thinks they can squeeze me out, but I've got plans they don't know about." Rose looked up sharply at the mention of the Hayes name. "What do you mean?" Jeremiah smiled, a rare expression that didn't reach his eyes. "I've secured water rights to the creek that feeds their south pastures. Come spring, I'm damming it up. Let's see how they like watching their cattle go thirsty." Horror washed over Rose. "But that would devastate their ranch," she protested before she could stop herself. Jeremiah's smile vanished. "That's the idea." Old Man Hayes has been buying out or running off every small rancher in this valley for 20 years. It's time someone fought back. But surely there must be another way, Rose argued. Some compromise that wouldn't hurt innocent animals or the people who depend on them. Compromise? Jeremiah scoffed. There's no compromising with people like the Hayes family. They understand only one thing: power. And it's time they learned they don't hold all of it in this valley. Rose fell silent, her appetite gone. The thought of being party to such vindictive action turned her stomach, yet what could she do? She was just a wife, with no say in her husband's business dealings or moral choices. The day after Christmas dawned clear and bitterly cold. Rose stood on the porch, wrapped in her heaviest shawl, and watched as Jeremiah loaded his wagon for the journey to Denver. There had been a heavy snowfall 3 days earlier, but the trail to town was reportedly passable, and Jeremiah was determined to make his appointments at the bank. "Remember, keep the doors locked at night," he instructed as he prepared to leave. "And don't go wandering off in the snow. A storm can come up quick in these mountains, and I don't want to come home to find my wife frozen in a drift somewhere." "I'll be careful," Rose promised, suppressing the urge to remind him that she wasn't a child. Jeremiah nodded, then surprised her by leaning down to press a perfunctory kiss to her forehead. "Be here when I get back," he said, and Rose wasn't sure if it was a request or a command. She stood watching until the wagon disappeared around the bend in the road, then turned and went back inside. The house seemed larger somehow, emptier, yet also less oppressive. For the first time since her arrival in Colorado, Rose was truly alone. The first few days passed quietly. Rose kept to her usual routine, cooking simpler meals for one, mending clothes by the fire in the evenings, and working on her carvings. The ranch hands came by each morning to check on her and report on the livestock, but otherwise she saw no one. On the 4th day of Jeremiah's absence, a fierce storm blew in from the mountains. Rose watched from the window as the world disappeared behind a curtain of white, the wind howling around the eaves like a living thing seeking entry. By nightfall, the storm had intensified to a full blizzard. Rose built up the fire, grateful for the ample supply of wood Jeremiah had insisted on stockpiling. As the temperature dropped, she dragged her quilts into the parlor and made a bed on the floor near the hearth, unwilling to face the cold bedroom alone. Sometime in the darkest part of the night, Rose was awakened by a sound that didn't belong to the storm. A thudding at the door, insistent and desperate. For a moment she lay frozen in fear, wondering if the wind had somehow worked the latch loose. Then she heard it, a voice calling her name, barely audible above the howling gale. Rose threw off her quilts and hurried to the door, her heart pounding. It took all her strength to pull it open against the force of the wind, and when she did, the sight that greeted her stole her breath away. Hunter Hayes stood on her porch, snow-covered and half-frozen, supporting a slumped figure that Rose recognized with a shock as Charlotte. "Thank God," Hunter gasped, his lips blue with cold. "We didn't think we'd make it." Rose stepped back, holding the door wide. "Come in quickly." Hunter half-carried his sister into the warmth of the house, and Rose quickly shut the door against the howling storm. Charlotte's face was alarmingly pale, her eyes closed and her breathing shallow. "What happened?" Rose asked, already moving to build up the fire. "We were returning from the Peterson place," Hunter explained, easing Charlotte down onto the makeshift bed Rose had abandoned. "The storm came up so fast. We lost the trail and Charlotte's horse stumbled in a drift. She fell. I think her arm is broken." Rose knelt beside Charlotte, gently brushing snow from the young woman's face. "Charlotte, can you hear me?" Charlotte's eyelids fluttered, then opened. "Rose," she murmured, confusion evident in her pain-glazed eyes. "Where?" "You're at my home," Rose soothed, stroking Charlotte's hair back from her forehead. "You're safe now." Charlotte nodded weakly, then winced as the movement seemed to remind her of her injury. "My arm," she whispered. "Try not to move," Rose instructed, turning to Hunter. "We need to get her warm and dry first, then see to the arm. There are blankets in the chest upstairs, first room on the right, and I'll need to heat water." Hunter nodded, already moving toward the stairs. As he disappeared from view, Rose began to gently remove Charlotte's snow-soaked outer garments. The younger woman's left arm hung at an unnatural angle, confirming Hunter's assessment of a break. By the time Hunter returned with an armload of blankets, Rose had Charlotte out of her wet clothes and wrapped in one of her own nightgowns. Together, they made her as comfortable as possible near the fire, propping her injured arm on a cushion to keep it immobile. "I've never set a broken bone," Rose admitted quietly to Hunter as they stepped away to allow Charlotte to rest. "Have you?" Hunter ran a hand through his hair, still damp with melting snow. "Once, when one of the ranch hands fell from a horse. But I'm no doctor." Rose squared her shoulders. "Well, we can't get her to a doctor in this storm. We'll have to do our best." The next hour was a blur of activity. Rose heated water and tore strips from an old sheet for bandages. Hunter found 2 straight pieces of kindling that could serve as splints. Together, they planned how best to set the broken arm with minimal pain to Charlotte. "I'll hold her still," Hunter said, his voice tight with worry. "You straighten and splint the arm." Rose nodded, trying to project a confidence she didn't feel. "Charlotte," she said gently, kneeling beside the injured woman, "we need to set your arm. It's going to hurt, but it has to be done." Charlotte's eyes, so like her brother's, met Rose's with clear understanding. "Do it," she said simply, her jaw set with determination. Hunter moved to hold his sister's shoulders and good arm, while Rose took a deep breath and grasped Charlotte's broken limb. With a silent prayer, she pulled steadily, aligning the broken bone as best she could by feel alone. Charlotte's cry of pain cut through her like a knife, but Rose forced herself to continue, securing the splints with firm bandages. When it was done, Charlotte lay pale and sweating, but the worst seemed over. Rose mixed a dose of laudanum from Jeremiah's medicine cabinet and helped Charlotte drink it to ease the pain. "You should rest too," she told Hunter, noticing for the first time how exhausted he looked. "The storm won't let up before morning, and you're half frozen yourself." Hunter nodded wearily. "Thank you, Rose, if we hadn't found your light in the window." He didn't need to finish the thought. They both knew what fate awaited those caught unprepared in a mountain blizzard. Rose busied herself making coffee while Hunter removed his wet outer clothes. In the firelight, she could see that beneath his rugged exterior was a young man not much older than herself, vulnerable in his concern for his sister and his gratitude for the shelter Rose provided. "Here," she said, handing him a steaming cup, "it will help warm you." Their fingers brushed in the exchange, and Rose felt the same jolt of awareness she had experienced when dancing with him months earlier. Judging by the sudden intensity in Hunter's gaze, he felt it too. "Rose," he began, his voice low to avoid waking Charlotte, who had finally drifted to sleep under the influence of the laudanum. "Don't," Rose interrupted softly. "Please, Hunter, whatever you're going to say, don't say it." He studied her face for a long moment, then nodded, respecting her boundary even as his eyes conveyed a depth of feeling that words could only have diminished. They sat in silence for a time, listening to the storm's fury gradually diminishing as the night wore on. Eventually, Hunter's head began to nod, exhaustion claiming him despite his efforts to remain alert. "Sleep," Rose urged. "I'll watch over Charlotte." Hunter looked as if he might protest, but the events of the day had taken their toll. With a grateful nod, he stretched out on the floor near his sister and was asleep within moments. Rose sat in the rocking chair by the fire, watching over her unexpected guests as the night slowly gave way to dawn. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world transformed by snow. Sunlight sparkled on the pristine white landscape, deceptively peaceful after the night's violence. Charlotte woke first, groggy from the laudanum but more alert than the night before. "We made it to your place," she murmured, looking around with greater awareness. "I remember now." "Just in time," Rose confirmed, helping Charlotte sit up and sip some water. "How's the arm?" Charlotte winced as she shifted position. "Painful, but I'll live, thanks to you and Hunter." At the sound of his name, Hunter stirred, then sat up abruptly, immediately alert. "Charlotte, how are you feeling?" The siblings exchanged words of reassurance, and Rose slipped away to the kitchen to prepare breakfast. As she worked, she could hear their quiet conversation, the deep affection between them evident in every word. It struck her then how different the Hayes siblings were from what Jeremiah had described. Far from being calculating and power-hungry, they seemed to genuinely care for one another and for others in the valley. Rose thought of Charlotte's kindness in including her in the quilting circle, of Hunter's concern for her welfare even when it wasn't his place to show it. And she thought of Jeremiah's plan to dam the creek, to deliberately cause harm to the Hayes ranch out of spite and a desire for revenge. The contrast between her husband's vindictive scheme and the warmth of the two people in her parlor could not have been more stark. Rose returned with a tray of simple food, oatmeal sweetened with the last of the summer's preserved berries, coffee, and bread toasted over the fire. "You're an angel, Rose Blackwell," Hunter declared as she handed him a steaming bowl. "I don't know what we would have done without you last night." "Anyone would have done the same," Rose demurred, uncomfortable with his praise. "No," Charlotte said quietly, her clear eyes seeing too much. "Not anyone. Some would have left us to the storm." The unspoken implication hung in the air, that Jeremiah might have been one of those who turned them away, regardless of the deadly consequences. After breakfast, Hunter went to check on their horses, which had been hastily stabled in Jeremiah's barn the night before. Rose helped Charlotte wash and change into one of her own dresses, carefully working the injured arm through the sleeve. "I can't thank you enough," Charlotte said as Rose braided her hair. "For the shelter, for setting my arm, for everything." Rose smiled, securing the braid with a ribbon. "I'm just glad you found your way here. The thought of you and Hunter lost in that storm." "He wouldn't give up," Charlotte said softly. "Even when I told him to go on without me to save himself, he refused. He said he saw a light in the distance, and he was determined to reach it." She looked up at Rose with an expression that held both gratitude and something more complex. "He's always been that way. Once Hunter decides something matters, nothing can deter him." Rose busied herself with tidying the room, avoiding Charlotte's perceptive gaze. "Your brother is a good man," she said carefully. "You're fortunate to have each other." "Yes," Charlotte agreed, "and now it seems we have you too." Before Rose could formulate a response, Hunter returned from the barn. "The horses are fine," he reported, "and the trail looks passable now that the sun's up. We should head home while the weather holds." Rose felt a pang at the thought of their departure, of returning to the solitude that had seemed so welcome just a day earlier, but she knew it was for the best. Her reputation, already precarious after the dancing incident, could not withstand the gossip that would inevitably follow if it became known that Hunter Hayes had spent the night under her roof, regardless of the circumstances. "I'll pack some food for your journey," she said, moving toward the kitchen. Hunter caught her arm gently as she passed. "Rose," he said quietly, "what you did for us. I won't forget it." The simple words, spoken with such intensity, threatened to undo all of Rose's careful composure. "It was nothing," she insisted, pulling away from his touch. "Anyone would have done the same." Hunter shook his head, a sad smile touching his lips. "You know that's not true, just as you know there's more I want to say, more I feel that I have no right to express." "Hunter, please," Rose whispered, painfully aware of Charlotte watching them from across the room. "Don't make this harder than it already is." Something in her face must have conveyed the depth of her confusion and pain, for Hunter stepped back, releasing her arm. "You're right, I'm sorry. Some things are better left unspoken." An hour later, Rose stood on the porch watching as Hunter helped Charlotte onto her horse, then mounted his own. The snow sparkled in the midday sun, turning the landscape into a sea of diamonds that hurt the eyes to behold. "Remember, change the bandages daily," Rose called to Charlotte, "and keep the arm immobile as much as possible." Charlotte nodded, adjusting her position in the saddle to accommodate her splinted arm. "I'll see you at quilting on Wednesday," she promised. "Wild horses couldn't keep me away." Hunter touched his hat in a gesture that had become familiar to Rose. "Thank you again, Mrs. Blackwell," he said formally, the return to her married name a pointed reminder of the boundary that must exist between them. Rose nodded, wrapping her shawl more tightly around herself against the cold. "Safe journey, Mr. Hayes. As they rode away, Rose felt tears sting her eyes. She blinked them back, telling herself it was merely the glare of sun on snow that caused them. But in her heart, she knew the truth. In the span of a single night, her carefully constructed world had been irrevocably altered. For now she knew with devastating certainty that it was possible to be married to one man while her heart belonged to another. The days that followed passed in a blur of routine tasks and sleepless nights. Rose threw herself into cleaning the already spotless house, reorganizing cupboards that needed no reorganizing, and carving an entire menagerie of woodland creatures from scraps of kindling. On Wednesday, true to her word, Charlotte appeared for quilting circle, her arm still splinted but her spirits as bright as ever. Rose rode with her to town, grateful for the companionship that temporarily distracted her from her turbulent thoughts. The other women exclaimed over Charlotte's injury and Rose's quick thinking in setting the bone. Mrs. Peterson, the preacher's wife, patted Rose's hand approvingly. "You've got a healer's touch, my dear." The doctor couldn't have done better himself. Rose accepted their praise with modest smiles, but inwardly winced at being held up as an example of frontier wifely virtue when her thoughts were so far from virtuous. Every night, alone in her bed, she found herself remembering the way Hunter had looked at her in the firelight, the words he had almost spoken, the feeling of his hand on her arm. January gave way to February, and still Jeremiah did not return. Rose received a brief letter saying his business was taking longer than expected and that he might not be back until early March. She read the letter with a mixture of relief and guilt, relief at the extended solitude, guilt at the relief. It was on a clear, cold day in mid-February that Rose heard a knock at her door. She had been in the kitchen, kneading bread dough, and her hands were covered in flour as she went to see who had come calling. Opening the door, she found Hunter Hayes standing on her porch, a package tucked under his arm. "Hunter," she said, surprise making her forget formality, "I wasn't expecting visitors." He smiled, though there was a certain restraint in his expression that hadn't been there before. "I was in town and volunteered to bring you this," he explained, holding out the package. "It's from the ladies at the quilting circle, a thank you for taking care of Charlotte." Rose wiped her hands on her apron before accepting the parcel. "That's very kind but completely unnecessary. How is Charlotte's arm healing?" "Well," Hunter replied, "the doctor says you did a fine job with the setting. She'll have full use of it again by summer." "I'm glad to hear it," Rose said sincerely. An awkward silence fell between them, heavy with unspoken words. Finally, Hunter cleared his throat. "I should be going. The weather looks clear now, but there's a bank of clouds coming in from the west that I don't like the look of." Rose nodded, trying to ignore the disappointment that washed over her. "Of course, thank you for delivering the package." Hunter turned to go, then paused, looking back at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Rose," he said quietly, "are you happy here?" The simple question, asked with such genuine concern, broke through the careful wall Rose had built around her emotions. "I'm doing my duty," she answered, the words sounding hollow even to her own ears. Hunter stepped closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of darker blue in his eyes. "That's not what I asked." Rose looked away, unable to meet his gaze. "It doesn't matter if I'm happy. I made my choice. I gave my word." "It matters to me," Hunter said softly. "More than I have any right to admit." Rose felt tears welling in her eyes and blinked them back furiously. "Please don't," she whispered. "I can't. We can't." Hunter reached out, gently lifting her chin until she had no choice but to meet his gaze. "I know, believe me, I know, but I need you to understand something, Rose Vallier Blackwell. You're more than just a bride," the cowboy whispered to the shy settler girl. "You're a woman of courage and compassion, of strength and gentleness. You deserve a life filled with joy, not mere duty." A tear escaped despite Rose's efforts, sliding down her cheek. Hunter caught it with his thumb, the touch so tender it nearly undid her completely. "I should go," he said, dropping his hand, "before I say more that I'll regret." Rose nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Hunter backed away, then turned and strode quickly to his horse. She watched him mount and ride away, remaining on the porch long after he had disappeared from view. Finally, she went inside and opened the package. Inside was a beautiful quilt, each square lovingly crafted by a different woman from the quilting circle. A note pinned to one corner read simply, "To remind you that you're never truly alone in this valley." Rose spread the quilt on her bed that night, running her fingers over the varied patterns and stitches that represented the community she had found in Silverdale. As she drifted off to sleep, she wondered what it said about her that the first true connection she had felt since arriving in Colorado came not from her husband, but from near strangers who had welcomed her with open hearts. March arrived with warmer temperatures and the first hints of spring. The snow began to melt, revealing patches of brown earth that promised eventual renewal, and with the thaw came Jeremiah, his wagon loaded with supplies from Denver and his mood unusually buoyant. "Good news," he announced as he strode into the house after his long absence. "The bank has extended my loan. I'll be able to buy out the Johnson place to the south once the paperwork goes through." Rose greeted him with the dutiful smile of a wife welcoming her husband home, but inside she felt nothing but a dull resignation. "That's wonderful," she said, taking his coat. "You must be hungry after your journey. I'll heat up some stew." As they ate dinner, Jeremiah talked at length about his business dealings in Denver, the connections he had made, the plans he had for expanding their holdings. Rose nodded in all the right places, asked appropriate questions, and tried to ignore the hollow feeling in her chest. It wasn't until they were preparing for bed that Jeremiah mentioned the Hayes family. "Heard in town that Charlotte Hayes had a bad fall during that February blizzard," he said, pulling off his boots. "Broke her arm, they say." Rose kept her expression neutral as she brushed her hair. "Yes, I heard that at Quilting Circle. Fortunate that she wasn't more seriously injured." Jeremiah grunted. "Fortunate for them, maybe. One less Hayes in the world wouldn't trouble me overmuch." He glanced at Rose's reflection in the mirror. "Speaking of the Quilting Circle, Mrs. Peterson mentioned you missed a few meetings while I was gone." Rose set down her brush, her heart suddenly racing. "The weather was bad and I didn't want to risk the ride alone." Jeremiah nodded, apparently accepting her explanation. "Sensible, though I hear Hunter Hayes has been calling on you in my absence." The accusation, calmly delivered, sent a chill through Rose. "He delivered a package from the quilting ladies," she said carefully. "A quilt they made for me. It was a single visit in broad daylight." Jeremiah's eyes narrowed as he studied her face. "Just the one visit." "You're certain?" "Of course I'm certain," Rose replied, indignation giving her voice a strength she didn't feel. "I am your wife, Jeremiah. I know my duty." He watched her a moment longer, then nodded, seemingly satisfied. "Good. Because my plans for the Hayes Ranch are coming to fruition, and I wouldn't want any personal entanglements to complicate matters." Rose turned back to the mirror, hiding her expression. "What plans are those?" "The dam on Cedar Creek," Jeremiah reminded her. "I've hired men to begin construction next week. By summer, Hayes's southern pastures will be dry as dust, and he'll have no choice but to sell to me at whatever price I set." Rose stared at her reflection, barely recognizing the pale, conflicted woman who gazed back at her. In that moment, she realized that the quiet discontent she had lived with for months had hardened into something more definitive. She could no longer pretend to be the dutiful wife, while her husband deliberately caused harm to people she had come to care for. "You can't do this," she said quietly, turning to face Jeremiah. "What did you say?" he asked, his tone dangerously soft. Rose straightened her spine, meeting his gaze directly. "I said you can't do this. Damming that creek won't just hurt the Hayes family. It will hurt innocent animals, other ranches downstream, the entire valley ecosystem." Jeremiah's expression darkened. "Since when did you become an expert on ranching, Rose? Or on what I can and cannot do with my own property?" "This isn't about property," Rose argued, finding courage she didn't know she possessed. "It's about right and wrong. And deliberately causing harm to others out of spite is wrong." Jeremiah stepped toward her, his face flushed with anger. "Spite? Is that what you think this is?" This is business, Rose. This is survival in a world where only the strongest prosper. No, Rose countered, standing her ground despite the fear churning in her stomach. This is revenge. And it's beneath you, Jeremiah. For a moment she thought he might strike her. His fists clenched at his sides and a vein pulsed in his temple. But then, to her surprise, he laughed, a hard, humorless sound that chilled her more than his anger. Beneath me, he repeated. That's rich, coming from a woman who sold herself to the highest bidder to escape destitution. The cruel accuracy of his words struck Rose like a physical blow. That's not fair, she whispered. Isn't it? Jeremiah countered. Let's speak plainly, Rose. Ours was a transaction, not a love match. I needed a wife to keep my house and eventually bear my children. You needed security and a roof over your head. We both got what we bargained for. Rose felt tears sting her eyes but refused to let them fall. Is that all marriage means to you? A transaction? Jeremiah shrugged, the anger seeming to drain from him, replaced by a cold pragmatism that was somehow worse. It's what our marriage means, and it's worked well enough until now. His eyes narrowed. Unless something has changed, unless someone has put ideas in your head about romance and passion and other foolishness that has no place in the real world. No one has put ideas in my head, Rose said, the lie bitter on her tongue. I simply believe there should be more to life, to marriage, than duty and obligation. Jeremiah studied her for a long moment, then sighed. Go to sleep, Rose. We'll talk no more of this tonight. My mind is made up about the dam, and nothing you say will change it. As Rose lay beside her husband that night, listening to his steady breathing, she felt as if she stood at a crossroads. For months she had told herself that duty and honor required her to be a loyal wife, regardless of her own happiness. She had made a bargain, given her word, and breaking that promise seemed unthinkable. But now, faced with becoming complicit in Jeremiah's vindictive scheme, she began to question whether true honor might sometimes require breaking a promise rather than keeping it. The following week brought the first real warmth of spring. The snow retreated further each day, and the earliest wildflowers began to appear in protected southern exposures. Rose went about her duties mechanically, her mind consumed with the moral dilemma that had robbed her of sleep since Jeremiah's return. She had not been to Quilting Circle since their argument, pleading a headache when Charlotte came to collect her. The truth was, she couldn't bear to face the Hayes family while her husband plotted their destruction, nor could she bring herself to betray Jeremiah by warning them of his plans. On a clear Thursday morning, Rose was hanging laundry when she heard riders approaching. Looking up, she saw a group of men she didn't recognize, led by a rough-looking individual with a week's growth of beard and cold eyes. Behind them came a wagon loaded with tools and building materials. Jeremiah emerged from the barn, greeting the men with handshakes and backslaps. "Right on time, Jackson," he said to the leader. "We'll start at the Narrows, where the creek passes between those two rock outcroppings." Rose felt her stomach sink as she realized these must be the men Jeremiah had hired to build the dam. The project was moving forward, and she seemed powerless to stop it. That night at dinner, Jeremiah was in high spirits, talking animatedly about the progress the men had made in just one day. "Jackson knows his business," he said, helping himself to more potatoes. "Says we'll have the basic structure in place within a week and the full dam completed before the spring runoff." Rose pushed food around her plate, appetite gone. "And then what?" she asked quietly. Jeremiah looked up, brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" "After you've built your dam and dried up the Hayes pastures, then what? Will you be satisfied then?" Jeremiah's expression hardened. "I'll be satisfied when I own this entire valley, from the mountains to the town, when every man who ever looked down on me has to come hat in hand asking for my goodwill." He studied her face. "Why do you care so much about what happens to the Hayes family, Rose? What are they to you?" Rose met his gaze steadily. "They're neighbors, fellow human beings, and Charlotte Hayes has shown me more kindness in a few months than many people show in a lifetime." "Kindness?" Jeremiah scoffed. "The Hayes family knows nothing of kindness. They only know power and how to wield it." "You're wrong," Rose said, setting down her fork. They're good people who care about this valley and everyone in it. If you just talk to them, try to work together instead of against them. Enough, Jeremiah slammed his hand on the table, making the dishes jump. I didn't bring you out here for your opinions on how I conduct my business. Your job is to keep my house and eventually bear my children, not question my decisions. Rose felt something break inside her at his words, the final thread of obligation that had kept her bound to this loveless marriage. Is that truly all I am to you? She asked, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her heart. A possession, a convenience. Jeremiah's expression softened slightly, perhaps recognizing he had gone too far. Rose, you're my wife. I provide for you, protect you. In return, I expect loyalty and obedience. That's the natural order of things. No, Rose said, rising from the table. That's your order of things, and I can no longer abide by it. Without waiting for his response, she turned and walked out of the house, letting the door close behind her with quiet finality. The evening air was cool but not cold, fragrant with the scent of new growth and possibility. Rose walked with no particular destination in mind, simply needing to be away from the suffocating atmosphere of the house. Her steps took her toward the creek that had become the center of so much conflict, the creek that Jeremiah planned to dam to spite the Hayes family. As she approached the water, flowing freely now with the spring melt, Rose heard the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Looking up, she saw a familiar figure on horseback outlined against the darkening sky. Hunter Hayes reined in his mount when he saw her, surprise evident in his expression even in the fading light. Rose, what are you doing out here alone? The concern in his voice nearly undid her fragile composure. Walking, she replied simply, thinking. Hunter dismounted, leading his horse closer. It's getting dark, it's not safe to be out alone. Is anywhere truly safe? Rose asked, the philosophical question slipping out before she could stop it. Hunter studied her face, clearly sensing her distress. What's happened, Rose? The simple question, asked with genuine concern, broke through the last of her defenses. Jeremiah is building a dam, she said, the words tumbling out in a rush. On Cedar Creek, where it enters your southern pastures. He plans to cut off your water supply, force your family to sell to him. Hunter's expression darkened. When? They started today. At the Narrows. Hunter let out a long breath, running a hand through his hair in a gesture that had become familiar to Rose. I suspected something like this might be coming. My father and I have been watching the property line, but we didn't think he'd move so quickly. I'm sorry, Rose said, wrapping her arms around herself against the evening chill. I should have warned you sooner, but I didn't know what to do. He's my husband. Hunter's expression softened. You're telling me now? That took courage, Rose. They stood in silence for a moment, the only sounds the gurgling of the creek and the soft nickering of Hunter's horse. You should go home, Hunter finally said, before Blackwell notices you're gone and comes looking. Rose shook her head. I can't go back, not tonight, maybe not ever. Hunter's eyes widened. What are you saying, Rose? I'm saying that I cannot be party to his vendetta against your family. I cannot live in a marriage where I'm valued only for my usefulness. I cannot continue to deny what I feel, she broke off, realizing she had said too much. Hunter took a step closer, close enough that she could see the mixture of hope and caution in his eyes. And what do you feel, Rose? He asked softly. Rose looked up at him, finally allowing herself to acknowledge the truth that had been growing in her heart for months. Things I have no right to feel. Things that make me question everything I thought I knew about duty and honor. Things that frighten me with their intensity. Hunter reached out slowly, giving her time to step away if she wished. When she remained still, he gently touched her cheek, his calloused fingers impossibly tender against her skin. I've tried to stay away, he confessed, his voice rough with emotion. Tried to respect the vows you made, even knowing they weren't given freely or with love. But every time I see you, every time I think of you alone in that house with a man who values possessions over people, it nearly drives me mad. Hunter, Rose whispered, his name a prayer and a plea on her lips. What am I to do? Where am I to go? If I leave Jeremiah, I have nothing, no money, no home, no reputation. You have me, Hunter said simply, if you want me. And you have Charlotte, and all the women of the quilting circle who have come to care for you. You're not alone, Rose, not anymore. Before she could respond, the sound of an approaching rider made them both turn. A figure on horseback appeared on the ridge above them, silhouetted against the last light of sunset. Blackwell, Hunter murmured, instinctively moving to place himself between Rose and the newcomer. Jeremiah urged his horse down the slope toward them, his face a mask of cold fury in the gathering dusk. So this is where you ran to, he said to Rose, his voice carrying clearly in the still evening air. Straight to Hayes, I should have known. It's not what you think, Rose began, but Jeremiah cut her off with a harsh laugh. Isn't it? My wife alone with another man at dusk, looking at him like he hung the moon. I'm not a fool, Rose. Hunter stepped forward. Mrs. Blackwell was simply warning me of your plans for the creek, plans that won't succeed, by the way. My father has already filed an injunction with the territorial court based on prior water rights. Jeremiah's expression darkened further. Always one step ahead, aren't you, Hayes? Your father taught you well. But this isn't about the dam anymore. He turned his gaze to Rose. This is about loyalty, about keeping your word, about honor. Rose felt a strange calm settle over her as she faced her husband. Yes, she agreed. It is about honor, and I've realized that true honor isn't in blindly keeping a promise made under duress. It's in standing up for what's right, even when it costs you everything. Jeremiah's hand went to his coat, and with a shock, Rose saw him withdraw a pistol. You're my wife, he said, his voice dangerously quiet as he aimed the weapon at Hunter. Mine by law and by right, and no one takes what's mine. Time seemed to slow as Rose registered the deadly intent in Jeremiah's eyes. Without conscious thought, she lunged forward, placing herself between Hunter and the gun. No, she cried, this solves nothing. Move aside, Rose, Jeremiah commanded, his hand steady on the pistol. This is between men. No, Rose repeated, standing her ground. If you want to shoot Hunter, you'll have to shoot me first. And then you'll hang for murder, and what will all your land and power mean then? For a long, tense moment, the tableau held, Rose standing firm between the two men, Jeremiah with his pistol raised, Hunter behind her, his breathing quick but controlled. Finally, Jeremiah lowered the gun, a look of disgust crossing his face. You're not worth hanging for, he spat. Either of you. He holstered the pistol and turned his horse. Don't come back to the ranch, Rose. Whatever was yours, you left behind when you chose him over me. With that, he spurred his horse and rode back toward the homestead, leaving Rose and Hunter alone in the gathering darkness. As the sound of hoofbeats faded, Rose felt her knees give way beneath her. Hunter caught her before she could fall, his arms strong and secure around her waist. Easy, he murmured, supporting her weight. I've got you. Rose turned in his arms, burying her face against his chest as delayed reaction set in. He could have killed you, she whispered, trembling now with the realization of how close they had come to tragedy. But he didn't, Hunter soothed, one hand gently stroking her hair. Thanks to you, that was the bravest thing I've ever seen, Rose Vallier. She looked up at him, noting his use of her maiden name. What happens now? She asked, the uncertainty of her future suddenly overwhelming. Hunter's arms tightened around her. Now, if you'll allow it, I take you home to the Hayes Ranch. Charlotte will be overjoyed to see you. You can stay with us as long as you need to. No expectations, no pressure. And then, Rose pressed, needing to hear him say what his eyes were already promising. And then, Hunter said softly, when you're ready, if you're ever ready, there's a small cabin on the north side of our property. My grandfather built it when he first came to the valley. I've been fixing it up in my spare time, making it livable again. For what purpose? Rose asked, though she thought she already knew the answer. Hunter's smile was tender in the last light of day. For a dream I had no right to dream. For a future I could only hope for you, Rose, always for you. Rose felt tears spill down her cheeks, but for the first time in months, they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. Hunter Hayes, she whispered, reaching up to touch his face. I think I've been waiting my whole life to hear those words." As Hunter bent to kiss her, gentle and questioning at first, then with growing certainty as she responded in kind, Rose felt as if the final piece of a puzzle had fallen into place. Here, in the arms of this man who saw her not as a possession but as a partner, not as a duty but as a gift, she had found what she hadn't even known she was seeking, not just love but belonging. The territorial court took 6 months to grant Rose's petition for divorce on grounds of abandonment, as Jeremiah had indeed left the valley shortly after their confrontation, selling his property to a newcomer and heading further west. By the time the decree was finalized, the small cabin on the north edge of Hayes' property had been transformed into a cozy home, with curtains at the windows and a garden bursting with late summer vegetables. On a perfect September day, with the aspens once again turning gold on the mountainsides, Rose Vallier and Hunter Hayes were married in the Silverdale Church, surrounded by friends and family. Charlotte, her arm long since healed, stood as Rose's attendant, while Hunter's father, a tall man with the same clear blue eyes as his son, gave his blessing with evident pleasure. The celebration that followed at the Hayes Ranch was the social event of the season, with the entire valley turning out to wish the couple well. As dusk fell and lanterns were lit for dancing, Hunter led Rose away from the festivities to a quiet spot overlooking the valley. "Happy?" he asked, his arms encircling her waist from behind as they watched the first stars appear. "More than I ever thought possible," Rose replied, leaning back against his chest. "When I came west as a mail-order bride, I thought the best I could hope for was security and perhaps eventually a kind of companionable peace. I never dreamed I would find this, a true partner, a true home." Hunter turned her in his arms, his expression serious in the fading light. "You know it won't always be easy. Ranching is hard work, and the weather can be merciless, and there will be times when we disagree or disappoint each other." Rose smiled, touching his face with gentle fingers. "Of course. But we'll face those challenges together as equals, and that makes all the difference." Hunter bent to kiss her, a kiss that held both tenderness and passion, both promise and fulfillment. When they finally broke apart, breathless and laughing, he rested his forehead against hers. "You're more than just a bride," he whispered, echoing words spoken months ago in a moment of unguarded truth. "You're my heart, my partner, my home." Rose closed her eyes, savoring the moment and the man and the love that had found her when she least expected it. "And you," she whispered back, "are mine." Above them, the stars of the Colorado night sky bore silent witness to their vows, to the journey that had brought them together, and to the life they would build in this valley that had become, at last, truly home.